Welcome to the Texas News Podcast, where we dive into all things Texas politics and the future of independence in the state of Texas. On today's show, the new Civil War movie is out and everyone is talking about it. I'm going to do a deep dive into the movie to explore the plausibility of the fragmented America portrayed in the movie. I'm also going to do something that the movie didn't directly do, and I'm going to explore how this fictional breakup likely occurred. And finally, I'm going to discuss the impact this movie could have on our push for TEXIT. So don't go anywhere. All right, so glad you are back joining us for the Texas News Podcast. This one is pretty exciting for me. I went to the movies on Thursday and got the early showing ticket for the Civil War movie that's coming out. Now, if you've listened to previous versions or previous episodes of the podcast, you've heard me talk about this movie, especially talking about how TEXIT or Texas independence or the breakup of the Union keeps occurring over and over and over in popular culture. And previously, I've explored whether or not that's what people would call predictive programming. In other words, fake it till you make it, trying to force that sort of thing to happen, or just an outcropping of the conscious or subconscious belief that these things are indeed plausible. And of course, from an artistic perspective, some people may want to posit this sort of thing happening as a cautionary tale. And of course, the Civil War movie, if you don't remember me talking about it previously, it is everywhere right now. Everyone is talking about this movie. And I got to tell you, it's understandable. It even before the movie was released, back when they released the trailer, you had the term Civil War start trending on social media almost every single day since the first trailer for this movie dropped. It's definitely on the minds of people. And of course, the release of the movie, and now that people are actually getting to see it, is again pouring gasoline on the fire of the conversation around TEXIT. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because there are, honestly, as I've seen it, a lot of really bad takes on the movie. And I know some folks out there have seen it. They think it's phenomenal. They've seen it. They don't like it because they don't think it covered what they expected it to cover. And frankly, I'm pretty sure that that's what the maker of the movie, Alex Garland, I'm pretty sure that was his intention, was to give this snapshot of this particular event without really having to saddle it with existing political commentary, existing political biases, and he did a pretty deft job of that. But if you have not heard of this movie, let me just tell you, and I'm going to tell you that there may be some spoilers. So if you have not seen the movie, you probably want to stop listening right now, go see the movie, and come back and listen to this or watch this if you're watching on YouTube. But there may be some spoilers. I have done my dead level best to try to avoid them, but it could happen. And I want you to be as surprised as I was. I will tell you that I was positively riveted. And the reason being is I was looking at this movie, I think, through a very different lens than most of the people that were in the theater watching. Kara and I were in there watching it. And I mean, you could have heard a pin drop where some of those folks were. Of course, every time the presidential character in there mentioned that Texas should surrender, I let out an audible giggle. Ha! That'll be the day. But beyond that, perhaps making some of the other movie patrons uncomfortable, there was not a lot of conversation from them coming out of the movie. I think that they were having a very difficult time processing what they had just witnessed. I don't think it was a dislike for the movie. I don't think it was, they were just not interested in the movie. I think they were having a difficult time processing. And look, if I'm going to be honest, it's taken me a couple of days to really wrap my mind around everything that I saw in that movie. And people may say, "Look, it's a movie. It's Hollywood. Why would you give it that much thought?" Well, it's simply because there is a clear nexus between what is portrayed in that movie and current political discourse around the issue of Texas independence. Let's be honest. The opposition has used the idea of civil war to bludgeon TEXIT supporters repeatedly, and in I think unjustifiably. But let's be honest. Our opposition are not the sharpest knives in the drawer. But to really get into this, understand that the premise of the movie, it's really the where you jump into the movie is kind of the tail end of the story. It's like going to the last chapter of the book. But essentially, what has happened is the United States is fragmented into four main factions, uh, following some unspecified, detailed conflict. Right, so something or some things have happened, and now the United States is fragmented. You've got the United States, the loyalist states. I'll get into the factions here in a moment, but you've got Texas and California as the Western Alliance, on and on. But essentially, because the movie is not really about that aspect of it, that plays in the background. The movie is actually it centers around four reporters that are traveling from New York to Washington D.C. And they want to get pictures and an interview with the president because the word is that Washington, D.C. is about to fall. And so they want to go and they want to get those pictures and they want to get an interview. And they even talk about how dangerous it is, not because of the war, but because the forces of the United States federal government shoot reporters on sight. So, you really get to this part where, again, the entire movie really takes place in the last chapter of what is apparently a much larger story. And while the movie steadfastly tries to avoid becoming a commentary on modern politics, um, there are clues, right? We are never directly told how the Civil War started or what caused the states to break away or what caused the alliances to form. But there are clues, and those clues, and really the story behind it, I think, is rooted in an extension of the modern day political discourse about the future of how we are going to govern ourselves, whether or not Texas and other states are going to continue to be a part of the union. And so there has been a tremendous amount of discussion about the plausibility of the factions. Now, before the movie ever came out, during the trailer, some people grabbed screen grabs from the trailer of a purported map that was displayed in the trailer that showed the breakdown of the factions. And there have been some people, and I'll break this down for you here in a bit, that just say that these factions don't make any sense. But frankly, they make a lot more sense than it appears on the surface. And when we talk about them, I've already mentioned one faction is referred to as the Western forces, right? Now, no one is saying that it's a union, a political and economic union. It's just called the Western forces, and it's comprised of California and Texas. Okay, so you have California, the Republic of California, and the Second Republic of Texas that have come together in some shape, form, or fashion and are fielding a single military. Okay, so we know that they have seceded, they've withdrawn from the Union, they formed their own independent republics. And at some point in the movie, or before the movie, they have come together and created some sort of military alliance, which is then marching on Washington, D.C. Additionally, one that a lot of people keyed in on when they saw that map was the Florida Alliance. It basically is an alliance of southern states, got Florida, Georgia, and it's basically all of the southern states that are not Texas, with the exception of, say, Virginia, West Virginia, South Carolina, Kentucky's not in there. But the bottom line is they call it specifically the Florida Alliance. And again, the movie doesn't delve into the deeper political issues that surround these or any of the backstory. So being called the Florida Alliance essentially just says that they are at least allied in some way. What the nature of that is not explored. There really are no clues about it. So you really don't know. Additionally, you've got states up in the Northwest, all across the Canadian border to Minnesota, that are now called the New People's Army Alliance. And that is essentially a clue that says that when they're talking about these alliances, they're basically, for the purposes of the movie and the way that they're titled, it seems like they are at least minimally military alliances, right? And it seems that the only conflict that's happening here is between the Western Alliance, Texas and California, and the quote unquote loyalist states, or what's left of the United States of America. So that's the breakdown. And the interesting thing about that breakdown is, as I said, it's not as implausible as some people would have you believe. Now, what I think is a far more interesting discussion about this, other than sort of the kind of glossing over these alliances, are really trying to understand the backstory to try to piece it together. And I think I think Alex Garland really, that's what he wanted us to do. And I'll get to that more at the tail end when I talk about the impact of this. But I will tell you, there are breadcrumbs, there are little Easter eggs hidden all throughout the movie. And I don't know if it was intentional. I don't know if we're being sent on a scavenger hunt, or if this is just sort of the exclusive purview of fanboys. But the bottom line is, you find these clues dropped throughout. There is a definite animosity toward the presidential character, and really toward the federal government forces in total, right? I mean, they're just that there is this general animosity toward them, like they have done something terrible. And we actually hear from some of the characters in the movie. One is that the president has claimed an unconstitutional third presidential term, right? We heard something about the abolition of the FBI. We hear about the bombing of Americans, and that the president ordered the bombing of Americans. We find out at some point that although the map shows that Alaska is part of the loyalist states, there is a request, or I'm trying to not to spoil this, but there is a comment where Alaska is referred to as neutral territory. So you've got, beyond the breakup of these states and the fact that Texas and California are off as their own independent republics, you're left to sort of piece this together. And while it's, I understand that there is a need to have everything explained, sometimes movies just don't have the ability to do that, right? They're snapshots, and call that artistic license or limitations of the medium, whatever you want to call it. It really gets down to, how did we get to this point in the movie? Like I said, we're at the kind of the tail end of the story here. But definitely, it seems clear that some sort of unconstitutional acts by the government led Texas and California to break away from the Union, right? They break away solo. Oddly enough, something that we talk about a lot, about Texas not being in some sort of absolute political and economic union with other states, right? We can have military compacts, things like that, but to see them by themselves, perhaps it was, unconstitutional acts by the government that led Texas and California to break away from the Union. Or it could have been the act of breaking away was used to justify unconstitutional actions. But let's be honest, this scenario is 100% plausible either way, because we know the federal government has clearly shown that it finds the Constitution is absolutely no obstacle to its consolidation of power in Washington, D.C. You look at the actions of Washington, D.C. in relation to the Constitution, and look, if they can't find some kind of loophole or wiggle room or some ridiculous Supreme Court precedent, they'll just ignore it, right? I mean, that's the way the federal government is. So is it implausible to say, as a premise for this particular movie or the scenario portrayed in this movie, that the federal government did something, that its constitutional violations mounted up to a point where neither Texas nor California could stomach it. Now, granted, look, Texas and California are political opposites, right? But there is a scenario where it makes sense that they would team up. Some people look at that and say, it's so implausible. I can't believe that Texas and California would join together in anything. Well, if Texas and California both sought independence and someone tried to deny both of them that independence, maybe they would team up, right? But we'll get to that in a minute. But it also seems clear from what was presented or portrayed in the movie that the U.S. president, when Texas and California left, he woke up and chose violence, right? The statement that was made by one of the characters that the president bombed Americans seems to clearly indicate that he reacted badly to states leaving the Union, right? I mean, you couldn't say plausibly that, well, the president woke up and decided to bomb some civilians that were rioting someplace, right? Because that's not what they do. But if states like Texas or California, you could conceivably say that, okay, you had a president who woke up and lost his mind and decided, okay, the people went to the polls, they voted, they withdrew from the Union, so I'm going to go bomb Walmart in Houston. I mean, you could say that. It could happen. But very likely, it's that course of action, the bombing of Americans, that led to the other factions, right? I mean, we can explain Texas and California, but what about those other factions, right? If the response by the federal government was to bomb Texas or bomb California or bomb them both just for exercising their right to independence, then it's very likely that the states that formed the Florida Alliance were going to be the next domino to fall. I mean, politically aligned to a certain extent with Texas, a little more staunch feeling of adherence to the Constitution, rule of law. They did it before. I mean, you could make any case for why that would be it, but they were probably the most likely domino to fall next. And then, of course, with Texas and California and most of the southern states out, the remaining states would be hanging on to the federal government either through apathy, nostalgia, or under the threat of force, right? And while that was going on, the western states could seize the opportunity to finally be out from under the control of the federal government. And frankly, D.C. would be powerless to stop them. But remember, this is a movie. It's not a prophecy. And I think that's important for people to understand. You hear it all the time. This is a movie. It's not a documentary, right? It's not a prophecy. But understand that governments game out scenarios just like this all the time, particularly military. I literally was on a what they call a space on X, formerly known as Twitter today, and listened to someone who was in the military who was surveyed back in 1995 or 1996, asking all of the Texas soldiers that were in the military, if Texas left the Union, would they go with Texas or would they stay in the military? They were literally asked this question. And that's not the first time I've heard that story. We heard that this happened in 2012, right around the time of Obama's reelection. I mean, these things happen. So understand, governments game out scenarios just like this all the time, where you start with a premise and say, if this happens, then what? And then if that happens, then what? And then they game these things out and try to figure out what their response is going to be. And so, in last week's podcast, I talked about how well over half the states in the union are already ready to exit. And if you haven't listened to or watched that one, go back and understand, I still have the poll numbers right here on my desk. And it's amazing how many of those states that were talked about as part of those various factions that withdrew from the Union show high polling numbers of support for wanting to leave the Union, right? I mean, it's a chunk. And so seeing a break apart, I mean, let's just strip this down to its premise. The United States of America fracturing into separate entities or alliances or just independent states, that's well within the scope of reality. When you're polling numbers as high as these, and you're seeing states like Texas actually make moves that direction, then absolutely this enters into the realm of reality. It becomes plausible at that point. But when you have a movie like this one that really starts in the final chapter of the story, it's useful for us to use those same techniques that governments use to game these things out. Look at our current situation and speculate what could happen to bring us to the doorstep of this movie, right? What take it where we are. We have the beginning of that movie, right? The end of the story, and we know where we are right now. What would it take to get us there? And if we can draw a plausible path down that road, then understand that what happened in that movie becomes even more plausible. Okay, so I want you for a moment to imagine this. We're going to game this out. So let's say that the federal government continues on its current path of fiscal irresponsibility, its disregard for constitutional duties and rights of its states and citizens, right? Let's just say that things continue down the path that they continue on, the path of polarization, of endless debt, of collapsing borders to the detriment of the citizens in the states, political corruption, questionable election results. I mean, just plug in everything that we've seen and let's just continue it down the path. And we know that there is no spirit of repeal and reform in the federal government. And because of that, you wind up getting additional consolidation of power in Washington, D.C. All the things we know will happen if we don't get our independence, right? And so what we wind up seeing is the response in the states is not capitulation, it's support for independence, growing even beyond the majority that's supported in, say, Texas and California. We know here in Texas, the Survey USA poll in 2022 showed we were at 66% of likely voters. We know that the ICI poll that was that I talked about on last week's podcast through YouGov, they're well over 50%. Let's say that support continues to grow, that citizens in both Texas and California, for whatever reason, right, let them have their own reasons, but decide that they can't abide it any longer. And look, with the two largest economies in the union, I mean, it kind of makes sense. It's a much easier path for us to get out there and get it done. And so one or both decide to hold a referendum to let their citizens decide whether to peacefully become independent. Now, again, this is plausible. We're working on it here in Texas. The Texas Independence Referendum Act was filed the last two sessions. It will likely be filed again this next session. Right. And seeing that thing gets across the finish line is the only thing standing between Texans and a real up or down vote on independence. And we know that California has been working on it. I talked about Marcus Ruiz Evans on the last podcast and the CalExit guys that are working on a very same project. They want a referendum on independence. Okay, so plausible. So let's say one or both vote yes. For the purposes of this movie, you would have to have both vote yes, and we know the support exists for it to get across the finish line. More importantly, we know that in a straight up head-to-head fight between leavers and remainers, remainers can't make a good case for why either state should stay in the union because the federal government is so dysfunctional and broken. I mean, try to sell $34 trillion of debt to somebody. Nobody's buying that, right? So let's say that they both vote yes, right? So what we've had peaceful legislative process. The states vote on this issue. And as a response, to take the scenario that people ask about all the time, let's say the U.S. president gets his panties in a twist and he wakes up, he defies all logic and precedent, decides to implode 70 years of U.S. foreign policy on the issue of self-determination, decides to use military force to prevent the referendum results from being implemented. Now, think about this. The only crime at this point is that the people have voted. they didn't vote the way that the federal government would want them to vote, right? So the president, using no pretext, there's been no terrorist attack, no military threats from Texas or California, says, I'm sending in the military. Well, we know from a Zogby poll that was conducted a few years ago that an order like that, over 40% of the U.S. military would likely refuse to implement the order. They wouldn't comply because they view that order as unconstitutional. They believe that states have an absolute right to withdraw from the union if that's what the people want. And so for a president to even make that order, to say, look, we're going to send in the troops. These people voted, but they didn't vote right, so we're sending you in. And now you got 40% of the military that refuses to implement the order. And what happens? Well, when you have almost half of the military that's unwilling to execute an unconstitutional order, you're going to wind up with chaos in the ranks. It's going to lead to mass desertion of troops heading back to their home states. Say, you know what? I'm not going to stay here and be forced to commit an unconstitutional act. These soldiers will look at it and say, I took an oath to the Constitution. And what these people did was 100% constitutional. There's no prohibition in Article 1, Section 10, and therefore it is a right reserved to the states and the people in those states made their voices heard by a referendum, and I'm not going to go murder them because they voted in a way that the current regime doesn't like. So, I mean, imagine you've got troops deserting back to their home states, saying there's no way in the world I'm going to follow unconstitutional orders. And that is likely to decimate an already weakened U.S. military that's unable to find new recruits, right? So, now we're getting down the road. We're down the road probably, 4 years, maybe, 6 years, whatever it is. And you've got, again, if the federal government's continuing on its path, having half of the military either refuse your order or defect to their home states or desert is going to just take its toll on a weakened U.S. military that has had steadily declining numbers year over year over year, because the federal government's program is, you know what, I want you to be more sensitive to transgender people, then I want you to be militarily ready. And people are retiring out of the military, or they're doing their term and they're getting out, or they're just not joining because it's like, look, I signed up to serve my country, not going to sensitivity training. That sensitivity training is kind of the opposite of what people sign up for the military for, right? And so as the military readiness and the manpower continue to decrease, you suddenly take almost half of that and send them back to the house. And so with nearly half of the military unwilling to execute the order, but now everyone knowing that the federal government was willing to use military force, you got Texas and California who decide that although they can't agree politically, neither wants to be a bombing range for the federal government. So they enter into a mutual defense pact. They can look at that situation and say, look, we don't agree on a lot of things, right? Almost nothing do we agree on, other than the fact that we don't want to be bombed for exercising our right to vote on the issue of independence, for exercising our sovereign rights. And if you think that's beyond the pale, go back and listen to last week's podcast, where we talk about how California's governor has been going around touting that California is a nation state already. I mean, they're throwing the rhetoric out there like we're throwing the rhetoric here. So, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that two countries that don't agree on policy at all would say, you know what, we actually have mutual defense concerns. And if you don't think that's possible, I have a word for you. It's called NATO. NATO is made up of a bunch of countries that don't agree on a whole lot policy-wise, but at the end of the day, they have agreed to defend one another. So it's not unusual. It makes plenty of sense, and particularly if Texas and California realize that they're in the crosshairs of an out-of-control federal government. Sometimes you go, look, let California govern California, let Texas govern Texas, but you know what? If they come bomb one of us, they come bomb both of us. right? So it makes sense. So in the meantime, think about what the federal government's play is. The federal government's play is, look, if we're going to execute any military action, we got to purge any remaining disloyal elements from our ranks, right? We got to get them out of here. Anyone who is not a strict loyalist, who is absolutely unconditionally will obey orders without question, um, aka the American version of the SS, right? And we're going to purge out everybody else. We're going to send them to the house. We'll imprison them. We'll do whatever, but we'll get them out of here, which would shrink the ranks even more. But hey, they're loyal, right? And that's what matters. Okay. So once they've done that, then it's a matter of trying to bring the Western Alliance, Texas and California, back into the fold by force, right? If you were going to attempt it once, you've got to attempt it again. And the fact of the matter is that now you've got Texas and California that are ready, right? They saw this coming. They formed this Western Alliance, but yet the federal government decides to start with a strategic bombing campaign. Now, does this sound implausible? No, because think about every significant military operation that you have seen in recent years, right? At least I know in the last 2-3 decades, all starts with a strategic bombing campaign. So now they go in and instead of saying, look, let's negotiate, let's figure this out. I made a mistake. Let's see what we can do to repair this. Instead, what they do is they send in planes and decide to torpedo the Texas Capitol, or not torpedo, but shoot a missile into the Texas. I'm channeling my Gene Wu now, State Representative Gene Wu, who said, you're going to get a Hellfire missile for wanting independence. Well, according to this scenario, a president from his party might just do that, right? It's possible, but highly improbable. But let's continue with the scenario, right? So they start with a strategic bombing campaign, which harkens back to the line in the movie about bombing Americans, because at the end of the day, we all are Americans, even if we're not part of the United States of America, right? Loose classification of Americans. So again, another connection to what happened in the movie. But when you start bombing people and killing and murdering civilians, particularly for their only crime being they voted wrong, you start getting repercussions. And so this is where you see, like I mentioned a moment ago, where Florida would take a stand against the bombing of Americans and withdraw from the Union. And it would be quickly joined by other states throughout the South because of those cultural and political similarities. But they would join together in their own defense and trade pact called the Florida Alliance. And so now you have these states that don't want to get in between the U.S. federal government and Texas and California, because let's be honest, if Texas and California formed a defense pact and built up their military in the intervening time, there would be retaliation. I mean, that's how those sorts of things go. We're witnessing this happen between Iran and Israel right now, like literally happening, right? So, you see Florida and these other states say, look, we can't be aligned with this and we're going to protect ourselves. And they form the Florida Alliance. See, not part of the Western Alliance, not part of Texas and California, but their own alliance to say, look, we need to defend ourselves. And so as a result of the bombing, you've got the Western Alliance mounting an offensive against the federal government, and it begins its march to Washington, D.C. to eliminate the threat. Again, also plausible. And now with the federal government under the threat of the consequences of their actions, the president decides to suspend the elections and the constitutional limit on 2 presidential terms, and declares that because they're in military conflict, that he's going to take a 3rd term. Now, some people may say, well, that's just crazy. You can't imagine that the president would do something like that. 100% you can. I mean, let's not forget that during the Civil War in the 1860s, Lincoln suspended the constitutional guarantee of the writ of habeas corpus, right? He did all sorts of things. He tried to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court arrested because he didn't agree with him. These are things that we've actually seen before, where pieces and parts of the Constitution again. We get to sort of the very foundation of this, which is the federal government does not view the Constitution as an obstacle to its ends. It really hasn't for a very long time. But with that, now you have what is effectively a dictatorial president, where the president has suspended the Constitution under war powers or whatever kind of nonsense they want to claim. But boom, now you have the scenario that's portrayed in the movie. And so now the U.S. government is in the position where they have consolidated power, not just in Washington, D.C., but that power even further consolidated in the Oval Office. And it's in the position of having to fend off the Western alliance with little to no support domestically, since less than 15% of the populace supports the use of force against states that vote to withdraw. And if you think that's far-fetched, go back to the aforementioned Survey USA poll in 2022, which specifically asked that question about whether or not military force should be used to compel a state to stay in. So now you've got the remaining United States without Texas, without California, without the bulk of the southern states, aka the Florida Alliance, with severely depleted troops and an unenthusiastic population because they didn't want to do this crap in the first place. 85% of them didn't want it to happen. In their minds, it's probably better to go to the negotiating table or let them go than to go bomb Walmart in Houston because people voted wrong. And they would be right. Okay? But not only is there not support domestically, even normal allies from the international community won't support it. They would very likely condemn the U.S. government for using force to obliterate 60 or 70 years of U.S. foreign policy that has respected the right of the people to choose how they're governed. Let's be clear on this. The United States federal government for decades has sent men and women right here in Texas and all these other states to go fight, kill, bleed, and potentially die to uphold the right of self-determination for people all around the globe. And for the federal government to use force to the contrary right in its own backyard would smack of the hypocrisy of the greatest degree by the international community. And so they would not jump on board. They literally would sit this thing out. You can forget about the UK and the European allies and all these other people because they've been preached at for decades that we have to uphold this right of self-determination. And any government who doesn't do that deserves to be bombed. I mean, let's talk about Kosovo under the Bush presidency, or let's go back to Clinton and talk about Serbia and the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I mean, we could talk about all these things, right? But you understand where I'm going. And so if the international community condemns it, there will suddenly be some shaky confidence in the federal government's ability to pay off the debt. Now, remember, we're in the future here, and at the rate that we're going, which is about $1 trillion every 100 days, understand that we're probably at this point well over 50 or 60 trillion potentially, right? Because understand it won't be just $1 trillion every 100 days. It'll continue to grow and borrow, and that's just what the federal government does, right? But the international community at some point will not believe in the ability for a federal government that is under this much duress to pay back a dime. So it starts calling in its markers. It's trying to get its money while it can. And it begins to call in dozens of trillions of dollars in debt owed by the federal government. And with no backstop, the federal government's going to do the only thing that it knows how to do. And that's turn on the printing presses and lay that throttle wide open, printing money like it's going out of style, making electronic ledger entries, which leads to hyperinflation. There was a bit of a throwaway line in the movie where they went and stopped at a gas station and offered them $300 for fuel. And the guy said, "Look, $300 will get you a sandwich. Your choices are ham or cheese." And it wasn't until she specified that they were Canadian dollars that they were willing to accept it. Right. And this was literally on the road between New York and Washington, D.C. So right here, I mean, even the confidence among the loyalist states as to whether or not the money had any value, it was there to the point that the loonie, the Canadian money, was worth more. And, is that beyond the realm of possibility? No, we're just extending out existing behavior. We're just taking the players and saying, this is how they behave. How would they behave in this situation? And we're playing it out. And that's what the federal government would do. And so, with the federal government back on its heels, the Northwestern states, from that Free People's Alliance, Army Alliance, whatever it's called, right? They have no protection. The federal government can't protect them. So if Russia wanted to take Alaska, or China wanted to come do a landing on the West Coast, I mean, there's nothing stopping that, right? And so they also not only have this protection issue, but they have the risk of economic devastation if they remain tied to the Union. So, you've got this background of long simmering tensions between those Western states and the federal government over federal ownership of their land. This federal ownership of the land is a big thing in the Western states, and the federal government lords its control over those states to the point that they've not been able to develop resources in the way that they see fit. And so it's not beyond the pale to think that with all that long simmering tension and they see the federal government back on its heels, unable to function, unable to protect them, that they would exit and form the new People's Army Alliance. Again, it makes sense. There are people who will say, well, these states have nothing in common. Well, actually they do, because remember, they're not leaving as a block. That's not what happens here. What happens here is states leave on their own because it is a union of 50 states. States leave on their own, and then they assemble themselves in whichever way makes sense for them, to whatever degree makes sense for them. And so as those states break off, soldiers continue to desert and defect from the federal army and begin to head back to their home states. And so with virtually half of the states out of the Union, the Loyalists have less and less manpower, giving the Western Alliance a clear path to Washington, D.C. And with that, you can cue the start of the movie. Now, as I said, not saying that that's what's going to happen. It's not prophecy. In fact, I've had to piece that together from what we know is true today to what we see in the movie and see if there is a clear path to that makes sense. Now, understand, nothing that I said in that entire narrative as we were imagining together, nothing that I said was outside the realm of plausibility. In fact, most of the things that I said, I would classify as highly probable given those situations, right? If Texas saw, the mounting unconstitutional issues, is it probable that Texas will leave the Union? 100%. Is it probable that California would leave? 100%. Is it probable that you would have a cluster of states around Washington, D.C. and across sort of the heartland and the Midwest that would stay as part of the Union? Absolutely. Those are states that have not, to any significant degree, developed their own state identity. Does it make sense that, that you would have those Northwestern states? Sure. They have commonalities that would draw them together. The same thing with the Florida Alliance. All of those things are not just probable or not just plausible, but they're probable given that scenario. And so, I have to say, as we move on to talk about the impact, the plot, although fictional, essentially plays out aspects of TEXIT that the TNM has addressed for years. I mean, it's almost as if Alex Garland combed through old TNM Q&A sessions from my speeches or interviews that I've given. So many aspects of that movie, when you unpack them, are things that we have talked about or dealt with, or extensions of answers that we've given. I mean, we've been forced into situations where we've had to game this situation out for people. I have to do it all the time, particularly when I get asked about the potential for the federal government's use of force if Texans decide they want to leave the union. And of course, my shorthand response is that if that were to happen, Texas may be the first to leave, but it won't be the last. Something that you see portrayed in this movie, or at least alluded to in this movie. I also say that a poor decision, like using force against any state that votes to withdraw, would lead to the eventual dissolution of the United States. Again, something that is played out in this movie, right? So, I'm not asking for my name in the credits for Alex Garland, but I would, I think it is important to acknowledge that a good bit of what we are seeing in the background of this movie are issues that we have addressed repeatedly. So I almost hope that they haven't combed through our Q&As. I almost hope that they haven't listened to any of the speeches or read any of the material on our site, because what that means is that someone came in with a third-party view and came to the same conclusions that we did, to essentially say, look, if a state decides to leave, it's not the state's fault if violence breaks out, right? If Texas votes to leave the union, if there's violence, it won't be on our part. It'll be on the part of the federal government, and the probability of that is very low for a lot of different reasons, and maybe we'll do an entire podcast episode breaking that down. But again, the end result of that would be essentially what you see in that movie. And I'm not one to look at this. I literally said during this podcast, this is not a documentary. This is not prophecy. But you can game this out and show where this is a lot more probable than people will give it credit for. Now, since the movie's release, the movie has become kind of a Rorschach test. You've got everyone sort of projecting their own conscious or subconscious fears and desires onto the movie screen. They are seeing what they want to see, and I fear that many are missing the point here, right? But I will tell you that it's the left-leaning media that are having the most difficult time coming to terms with the fact that Texas wins in the end. I'm not giving away a spoiler there. Texas and California, the Western Alliance, are literally on the verge of the final push into Washington, D.C. when the movie starts. That's not news. That's not a spoiler. But, the Western Alliance of Texas and Florida, they were referred to in a Newsweek article. Just to give you an idea of how some of these guys are losing their minds over this. There was a Newsweek article over the weekend. They referred to the Western Alliance as the rebels, right? The rebels. But who are the rebels, right? Is it those who ignore the Constitution and fundamental rights of the states? Or is it those that can no longer ignore a long train of abuses and usurpations, right? I don't view the Western Alliance as the rebels in that movie. In fact, they're not. They're the ones that are respecting the right of the people to choose how they are governed and responding to military force used against them unjustly. No, the rebels are the ones that ignored the founding documents and continue to ignore the fundamental rights of the states and the people, right? That's who the rebels are. And I think that really gets down to part of the rub, why states want to leave right now, why states want to get out of the union. It's that viewpoint that somehow people that are concerned about how we're being governed, how the federal government has gotten way out of the box that was drawn into by the Constitution, how the Constitution just doesn't even matter to the federal government. Those people are being portrayed as rebels, as though it were some sort of slur. And they wonder why there's political polarization like we have right now. And I got to tell you, although Garland has said that the movie's not meant to be political, I have seen in more than one article over the weekend have referred to the president character in the movie as Trumpian. Right? I literally before recording, I read an article. I think it was in the New York Times where they essentially said that thing. They have equated the guy who played Ron Swanson's president character, or played Ron Swanson and on Parks and Rec, plays the character of the president, but they refer to his character as Trumpian, right? Uh, but interesting thing, I guess they must have missed that shot of the bust of JFK in the Oval Office. I don't know that Trump or a Republican president would have a bust of JFK in the Oval Office, but who knows, right? But honestly, whether you like or hate the movie, you got to understand the impact that this movie is going to have will likely be long lasting. This is not some B movie flash in the pan thing. It has elicited a tremendous amount of discussion about the future of independence and the future of the United States as an institution, right? And so this movie is a cultural outcropping of a lot of where people are in their minds right now, is going to continue on. And like I said, it is a bit of a Rorschach test. You are going to hear people continue to uh, bludgeon us, the people that are opposed to TEXIT. They're going to point to this movie and everything in it, and they're going to say that what is portrayed there is what we want because independence is bad, and if we vote for independence, then that's what will happen in the movie. And what they fail to understand is what we really want is to avoid the situation that's portrayed in the movie. And we do that by following a peaceful legislative process that culminates in a referendum on Texas independence. Now, there's nothing Civil War like about what I just said. But beyond that, it really is their choice on how all of this plays out. And my only advice to them is they should choose wisely. Well, friends, that is a wrap on Texas news for this week. I never thought I would do an episode of this where I broke down a movie. That was not on my podcast bingo card, but I appreciate you sitting in with me while I broke this thing down and really talked about. Hopefully, I really talked about the implications for TEXIT. But I really hope that at the end of the day, you understand how this plays out as much of a larger discussion about where this is headed. And I hope that just seeing this portrayed in a movie yet again, that Texas is an independent nation, should bring you some hope that we are closer than we have ever been. And with that, that is a wrap. I would encourage you to be sure to like and subscribe and comment everywhere you see this. Be sure to share it with your friends. And in addition, if you want to continue to support the work that we do in the TNM, including podcasts like this to get the information out, I would encourage you to head over to tnm.me/join and become a member today. There's all kinds of perks, but really and truly, beyond the perks, it's helping us advance the cause of Texas independence. It's helping us do the things necessary so that we can avoid that apocalyptic scenario that plays out in that Civil War movie. And with that, I will leave you with the words that I leave you with every time we're together. They're the words of Sam Houston when he said that Texas will again lift its head and stand among the nations. I believe that time is now, and the question is, will you stand with her?